All right, it's good to see everybody today. As I said before I started recording, I'm sorry to have to wear this sticker today. 122 days since the start of the war and since the capture of the hostages. Still hoping for their safe release and very, very frustrating. Not knowing what negotiations, if any, are going on, but we pray for their release. I wanted to share my screen and talk today, and this might last for another week as well, because I'm not sure we'll be able to get through this whole article. This article that appeared in the New York Times Magazine yesterday and appeared online either Thursday or Friday in the on their website if you subscribe to New York Times Online. So it appeared a couple days ahead of time, which is why I sent out a link to this in my Friday Israel update email. So I want to go through this, and because I think it's very important. It might not be the most ideal summary of the history of the state of Israel, but it is a place to start. And I would say there's debate on RavNet as to whether this is a good article at all. RavNet being the listserv for conservative rabbis, but I don't go by RavNet. I go by myself, and this is an interesting article that needs to be discussed with and talked out. In other words, you can't just read this and say, okay, this is the definitive history that everybody agrees on. So there are aspects about this that need commentary, and that's why I think it's important for us to talk about it today and most likely in another week of this as well. So there are books and books about the history of this. Let me, there's, I'm in my office. So there's this book. You can't see it because it's called From Time Immemorial, The Origins of the Arab-Jewish Conflict Over Palestine by Joan Peters. Somebody not Jewish writing about it. There's, just a second, just looking at other books on my shelf. I mean, I'm not going to take, there are tons of books. There are also, there's also this book written by a Palestinian Arab, which is a book that I still have on my shelf. So The Arab-Israeli Dilemma by Fred Khoury, Khouri. This is from a class that I took at Temple University when I was an undergrad. So that was in the very early 80s, from 1980 to 84, actually 81 to 84. No, is that right? Yes, 81 to 84. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I graduated high school in June of 1980, started Drexel University in September of 1980, but then transferred to Temple University, where I continued in January of 1981. So this is a class I think I took that semester at the main campus at Temple University, which opened my eyes to the Palestinian point of view, because I graduated Akiba Hebrew Academy in Philadelphia and went to Camp Ramah and was in USY. So I had the Jewish narrative of the history of the state of Israel, which essentially ignored any kind of Palestinian narrative to the history of the state of Israel. Okay, so with that being said, this article appeared yesterday in the print edition of the New York Times Magazine. And so let's just begin. 1 year matters more than any other for understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In 1948, Jews realized their wildly improbable dream of a state, and Palestinians experienced the mass flight and expulsion called the Nakba, or catastrophe. So I'll just stop here by saying Palestinians in 1948. So what we need to understand, and what Palestinian scholars, representatives, people today will refuse to acknowledge, is that there's no such thing as a Palestinian people in 1948. Okay? So that's not a very popular thing to say. It is the technically correct thing to say. However, the land that we're talking about in the article, we'll talk about it, but I just want us to understand this. The land that we know as the land of Israel was on maps in 1948 called British Mandatory Palestine. And we'll get to that in this article. It's called British Mandatory Palestine. The territory had been known, that piece of land, which, if you picture in your mind's eye, connects Africa by means of the Sinai Peninsula and Asia Minor, that is Turkey and Syria and Lebanon. Okay, so that whole coastal area had different names. Like under the Roman Empire, it was the province of Judea until the Romans destroyed the temple in the year 70. So it was known as Judea by the Romans. It was known as Palestine based on the Philistines, the ancient nation of the Philistines having been there. But were the people known as Palestinians? Before 1917, under the Ottoman Empire, there were different provinces in the Ottoman Empire. So this could have been the province of Syria, just extending down into that land. So there's no such thing really as a Palestinian people in 1948. There were indigenous Arabs, absolutely. There were indigenous people there. But were they organized in a way to call themselves Palestinians? We'll see that also later. So I just want to point out that this is an issue from the get-go. The assumption that the Palestinians have always been there and the Jews haven't. Okay? The events, 1948, are burned into the collective memories of these two peoples, often in diametrically opposed ways, and continue to shape their trajectories. If 1948 was the beginning of an era, it was also the end of one, the period following World War I, when the West carved up the Middle East and a series of decisions planted the seeds of conflict. That is absolutely true. That is a true statement. So no matter which side you're on, the Palestinian side, the Israeli side, or the I don't care side, this statement is absolutely true that Western powers, Britain and France, essentially, under the auspices of the League of Nations, which is what the United Nations was known as after World War I, that yes, Western powers carved up that land in the Middle East. To understand the continuing clashes, we went back to explore the twists and turns that led to 1948. This path could begin at any number of moments. We chose as the starting point 1920, when British mandate for Palestine was established. Now, there is, just want to, 1 second here, just want to make sure that I can see the Yes, okay, I'll be able to see the footnotes. There they are. Okay. Um, so I encourage people to find this article. I'll send when I send the recording of today's class. I'll also send a link, a link to a free article of this. The pictures are good to share as well. Okay. Over the following decades, that is, after World War I, two nationalisms, Palestinian and Jewish, took root on the same land and began to compete in a way that has ever since proved irreconcilable, right? Until today, it's irreconcilable. We have partial Palestinian Authority control over the West Bank. We have We've seen the tragedy and destruction that Hamas has wrought in the Gaza Strip. Okay. But a full peace, a perfect peace with the Palestinians, that has yet to be achieved. The Arab population wanted what every native majority wants: self-determination. So again, we'll see this in the course of the article. Jews who immigrated in growing numbers wanted what persecuted minorities almost never attain: a haven in their ancient homeland. Okay, so just want to look at this footnote. Footnote number 1, a haven in their ancient homeland. Take a look here all the way to the right here on your screen. A primary source dates the existence of a people called Israel to at least 1200 BCE. Okay, so we have the Bible. And as I always say in Bible class and in Torah study, almost every week, the Bible is not history. Okay, so the Bible is a religious perspective on the story of the Israelite people who became the Jewish people. It's a religious perspective, just like the Christian Bible is a religious perspective on the history of Christianity and the story of Jesus. The Christian Bible is not a history of Jesus and the founding of the church. Okay? The Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, that's what we call our Bible. That's the more correct term. We shouldn't call it the Old Testament. That's just giving in to Christian terms for the Bible, as opposed to the New Testament, right? Old versus new. So better Hebrew Bible, Christian Bible. So the Hebrew Bible is a religious perspective on the story, the origin stories, I'll call it plural, stories of the Israelite people who became the Jewish people. Okay? So corroborating evidence of what the Bible contains can go back to 1200 BCE. So that's a long time ago, right? 3,200 years. That's around the time of the Exodus from Egypt. There is no corroborating evidence of the Exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. So the Passover story, which we recount every year at the Seder, is just that, a story. But it's more than a story, it's a holy story. It's the foundational myth story of the Israelite people, the Jewish people. But there's no corroborating evidence to prove it. So evidence that we have, 1200 BC, is around the time of Joshua and the Judges. Okay, so that 1200 BC, I don't know exactly what that evidence is. We have evidence of the first temple in Jerusalem. We have evidence of a reference to the house of David, that is King David and King David's dynasty. So King David was 1000 BCE. So we can prove the people of Israel being in the land of Israel for 3,200 years. Okay? Then the footnote goes on. In 538 BC, Jews built the second temple in Jerusalem. Okay, so not even talking about the Babylonian exile and the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem. So again, this is the problem with an article in the New York Times that edits and and washes down all of history to something that the editors of the New York Times would think would be readable. Now, there are people who do read every single word of every single article in the New York Times Magazine. I would imagine that most people don't. And certainly people wouldn't read the footnotes. So I'm just saying that even the footnote is lacking in some information. Why just go to the second temple? Just mention the first temple too, because there's a huge load of evidence from the first temple in Jerusalem. That load of evidence, by the way, is found in a huge pile of dirt that the Muslim religious authority that has control over the Temple Mount today bulldozed over the side as they made improvements to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock buildings that are on the Temple Mount. So, okay, I won't react to that except to say there's this huge mound of dirt that the Israeli Antiquities Authority, the archaeologists from them, have sifted through and have found evidence. And one significant piece of evidence that they found was an amulet, a metal amulet, like a little scroll that they unwound and found on it the priestly blessing. So the threefold blessing that we recite, that Kohanim recite, that we recite for our children on Friday night. May God bless you and guard you. May God shine his countenance upon you and be gracious to you. May God shine his countenance upon you and grant you peace, right? So that in Hebrew was found on an amulet in that pile of dirt dated to 3,000 years ago. Okay, so that says a lot about the Torah because it's from the book of Numbers. And that's the oldest printed segment of the Torah that exists. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls that are 2,000 years old that have the entire Bible on them. That's the oldest edition of the Hebrew Bible, is the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the oldest section of the Bible that exists is that amulet that's 3,000 years old. Okay, so the editor here did not include First Temple here, only goes to the destruction of the building of the Second Temple in 538 BC. Most historians agree that it was 538 BC that it was built. Again, it should be BCE because BC means before Christ. BCE means before Common Era. So just interesting too, an accepted way of dating can be BC and AD, but for Jews, it's better BCE and CE, before the Common Era, the year zero, and the Common Era, post year zero, as opposed to BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, year of our Lord. Okay, just pointing that out too. So the Romans took the city in 70 AD, took most of the city in 70 AD. They already had the city. They destroyed the temple in 70 AD, destroying most of it, and Jews began to flee. Jews began to flee. Okay, so giving the impression that Jews eventually fled, that there were no more Jews left. And that's the wrong impression. There were always Jews in the land of Israel, just as there were always indigenous people there. We can't call them Arabs because the Arabs came when the Muslims came in 630. Okay, so Christians became the majority around 400 AD. That is when the Roman Empire converted to Christianity. So then, therefore, the Romans who were there running the land of Israel became Christian. Okay, so that's majority Christian then, or Byzantine. Muslims conquered Jerusalem by 638. When the Muslims conquered it, that's when they were called Arabs. So we should just understand that too. Okay, Jews were not, Jews this land of Israel was always inhabited by Jews. Yes, a very small population, but there were Jews there. When Jews traveled in the Middle Ages to Israel and wrote about their travels, Benjamin of Tudela in the 1200s, Nachmanides in the 1200s, 1300s, others who have written about it, Maimonides in 1100. Just three that I can name that I can name who wrote about it, and it was preserved for historians to read about. Found synagogues there and fellow Jews there, so it wasn't empty of Jews. There were always Jews there. So it's just important to put this in context, okay? That the Arab population of 1948 that's just what they were called since the year 600. There were always Jews there, and this is a complicating thing in this whole article and the whole discussion about the state of Israel. Okay, so I'll get more into that as we go on. In the time of the British Mandate, and of course, always feel free to unmute and ask a question as we go. In the time of the British Mandate, so that is after World War I, Jews and Palestinians, again, not right to call them Palestinians technically, and Western and Arab powers made fundamental choices that set the groundwork for the suffering and irresolution of today. Yes, that part is true. Along the way, there were many opportunities for events to play out differently. We asked a panel of historians, 3 Palestinians, 2 Israelis, and a Canadian American, to talk about, who teaches at Harvard, to talk about the decisive moments leading up to the founding of Israel and the displacement of Palestinians and whether a different outcome could have been possible. Now, how they chose these scholars, I don't know, and we can look at the end of the article to see who they are. And maybe I'll do that now. Just to say, see how long this article is. Okay, here's the names. Okay, so these are the panelists. Nadim Bawalsa is a historian of modern Palestine and the author of the 2022 book, Transnational Palestine, Migration and the Right of Return Before 1948. Is the associate editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies. Okay, perhaps makes him qualified to be on this panel. Just one second here. Yes, Dershowitz's book, A Case for Israel, details the history of the Jews in the land of Israel. Perry wrote on the chat. There are plenty of books that I could name that would be good books. Okay, so Lina Dalashe is a historian of Palestine and Israel who has, let me just say one other thing about a book. I haven't read this book, but I heard about this book. Just a second. There we go. Israel, a simple guide to the most misunderstood country on earth, written by Noah Tishby, who is an actress, producer, writer, and activist born and raised in Israel. Okay, so this is the most recent book that one could use to refer to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Okay, but written by an Israeli Jew. Okay, Lina Dalashe is a historian of Palestine and Israel who has held academic positions at Columbia University, New York University, and Rice University. She's working on a book about the city of Nazareth in the 40s and 50s. Abigail Jacobson is a historian of the Department of Islamic and Mideastern Studies at Hebrew University. Her latest book, written with Moshe Naor, is Oriental Neighbors, Middle Eastern Jews and Arabs in Mandatory Palestine. Derek Penslar, he's the Canadian American, is a professor of Jewish history and the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard University. His latest book is Zionism: An Emotional State. Itamar Rabinovich is a history professor and emeritus president of Tel Aviv University. He's also a former Israeli ambassador to the United States, I think. His books include The Road Not Taken, Early Arab-Israeli Negotiations. Oh, here it is. He was the Israeli ambassador to the United States from 1993 to 1996. Salim Tamari is a sociologist at Birzeit University in the West Bank and a research associate at the Institute for Palestine Studies. His latest book is The Great War and the Remaking of Palestine. So that is World War I and the remaking of Palestine. Emily Bazelon, if I'm pronouncing it right, a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine, moderated the discussion, okay, which took place on January 3rd. And just a second here. Let's go way back here. There we go. There we go. Here we go. We asked the panel, right, the conversation among the panelists, which took place by video conference on January 3rd, has been edited and condensed for clarity, with some material reordered or added from follow-up interviews. Don't have a problem with that, but of course, it's the New York Times conducting this panel and editing. So the editing also has a bias, right? So the way it's edited could reflect the editorial viewpoint of the New York Times itself. Emily Bazelon could have had a different viewpoint, but her editor decided how this final article would look. So that's important to keep in mind as well, that there's that perspective of the editors of the New York Times in deciding how this article was going to look in final published form. Okay. So let's start here. What was the British mandate? Okay, again, this is not news to me. I've studied this pretty extensively. But again, I only have a bachelor's in history. And a lot of the history classes I took were Jewish history classes, but I only have a bachelor's, and I took Jewish history classes as part of the curriculum in rabbinical school at the Jewish Theological Seminary. So I passed out of ancient Jewish history because I had that in college. I had to take a medieval Jewish history class and a modern Jewish history class. Okay, so these were what are called survey classes, where you cover a lot of material but don't get into the nitty-gritty. Okay, but there are other classes I've taken in college and elsewhere since then about this. So not too many of us might be familiar with the term British Mandate or Mandatory Palestine. So in other words, Cantor Gershon Levin, may he rest in peace, citizen of Israel, but was born in what was then British Mandatory Palestine. So anybody born in British Mandatory Palestine would, in 1948, could then automatically become a citizen of Israel, but you're also a citizen of the British Commonwealth. Okay, so for centuries, Palestine was an Ottoman province with no clear boundaries. So I guess there's it's just simpler to call it Palestine, but the problem, my problem is that you're just making something that wasn't absolutely true and technically true. So it would be better, but maybe not as fluid, to say for centuries the territory known as Palestine was an Ottoman province. That would be a lot easier and less biased, right? For those sensitive to the bias, than saying for centuries Palestine. Okay, so assuming that it was all Palestine and the Jews made it different. That's just not the case. It's not the case. Okay, For centuries, Palestine was an Ottoman province with no clear boundaries, which is true. And here's the footnote. Palestine sometimes meant a narrow strip of coast occupied by the Philistines in the 12th century BCE. But at other times, first occupied by them and written about in battles, the famous David Goliath battle. Goliath was a Philistine. There are other battles with the Philistines that are in the early historical books of the Bible. So the Philistines were there maybe from the 12th century BCE. We're not exactly sure. And how long were they there for? Until the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians, maybe? We don't know. We don't know for sure. The origin of the Philistines also is shrouded in mystery. Not sure. Some people think, historians think that they come from the island of Crete in the Mediterranean. We don't know. But at other times, Palestine was referred to a larger territory that included southern Syria, right? All the Ottoman Empire, by the way, it doesn't say here, for centuries, 1517 to 1917. That's the Ottoman Empire in the land of Israel. Okay? The walls that are currently surrounding the old city, the old city of Jerusalem, those walls were built by the Ottomans in the 1500s. Okay? You go within the wall, you'll find other walls, like there's a wall that you can see in the Jewish quarter, the remnants of a wall. Actually, there's an overlook there. If you've walked through the Jewish quarter, you might have missed it. But one entrance into the Jewish quarter, where the big plaza area is, there are shops there and a rebuilt synagogue, huge dome synagogue there. If you can picture that plaza, if you've been there before, one way in has a little overlook to a remnant of a wall that's supposedly from the time of Hanukkah. So the Maccabees defeated the Greeks in 165 BCE, which led to what's known as the Hasmonean dynasty, because the family was known as the Hashmonaim. So the Hasmonean dynasty built a wall around Jerusalem, and the remnant of that wall is right there. Okay, so there are other walls around, and go even further into the city of David digs from the time of King David, you'll see remnants there, and you can walk in a tunnel underground where the water flows from what the book of Isaiah describes as a tunnel built in the time of King Hezekiah to provide water to the besieged city of Jerusalem. Okay, so there's a lot of history there. The Ottoman part, 1517 to 1917. 1917 is World War I, when they were defeated by the Western Allies. Okay, Muslims were the majority since 638. Muslims were the majority since 638. That's what you got to add here. Okay, there weren't Muslims before that. So we just need to understand that history. There were Byzantines before that, Christians before that, Romans before that, Greeks before that, Babylonians before that, Assyrians before that, Canaanites before that. Okay, lots of people in this area that, if you look at the map, could be understood why it's an important geographical area. Muslims were the majority, living alongside small Christian and Jewish communities. Yes, they were small, numbering in the thousands. Not too many thousands, but numbering in the thousands. The Jews were almost entirely Sephardic and native to the region, with few nationalist aspirations. That's true. No such thing as nationalist aspirations until Theodor Herzl came along, this guy in this picture right here. Okay? With the influence of Western thought, Jews in Europe had national aspirations, but there was no, in the Arab world, there's no such thing as nationalist aspirations. That Western powers created nations out of what was the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so this whole concept of democracy, nationalism, these are Western ideas imposed on the regions. That's true. And the Jews being Sephardic, is that technically true? Yes, but there were every now and then some Ashkenazim who would make the trip from Europe to Israel and settle there. So there were pockets of Ashkenazim within the Sephardic community. Now, Safat, the city of Safed, Safat in Hebrew, was known as a Sephardic community because headquarters of Jewish mystical thought. After 1492, Jews are expelled from Spain. Where do the Jews go? Some go to the Netherlands, some go to the New World, some go along the Mediterranean, well, first they go to Portugal because that's the closest place, but then to the right, eastward, they go to Italy, they go to Greece, they go to Turkey, and they end up in Israel. So, and they end up like in Joseph Caro, Isaac Luria, lots of other people, rabbis, establish a Sephardic community because Sephardic comes from Sfarad, which is the Hebrew word for Spain. So the origin for them is in Spain, but the origin even before that is from Babylonia. So when the Muslim Empire expanded in the 600s, from then on, Jews expanded with them over North Africa all the way to Spain. Okay, so they were Jews coming from Babylonia, ending up in Spain, and establishing a community there, thanks to the Muslims there, who allowed non-Muslims to live relatively peacefully and to have access to all aspects of society. Anyway, I go far afield, and I do that because the article lends itself to doing that. You have to provide the background to it to understand that the terms, it's just easier in an article to do this, but it's not exactly right to just gloss over it by saying almost entirely Sephardic. Okay, just want to point out there are Ashkenazi Jews there too. Like after the pogroms, the Khmelnytsky pogroms in the 1640s in Ukraine, Jews left Europe then and made their way to Israel. It wasn't just Ashkenazi Jews from Europe after Theodor Herzl. There were streams every now and then based on persecution and oppression that would happen over the centuries, ending up in Israel. You know, just think about it. You know, travel today, picking up and moving today is not such a radical idea, right? Just take a look at my kids, for example. All four of my kids do not live here in Olney anymore, right? I got one because of medical school and residency in Rhode Island, and I got three others in the New York City area. Was it a big deal for them to move? No, not at all. And me, I helped them move. But in the Middle Ages, it's not easy to do that. Who could think of picking up and moving? Life was not so portable back then, and in fact, it was dangerous. You needed to have money to buy off robbers that you would inevitably encounter on your travels, right? So you had to be wealthy in order to travel. And so that already precluded a majority of the world population. So the discovery of the New World is because you had the treasury of kings and queens to pay for the expeditions to the New World. So Jews were part of that. And after that, yes, Jews went because where else are we going to go to escape persecution and oppression? Okay. So, with few nationalist aspirations, the relationships among Muslims, Christians, and Jews began to shift in the beginning of the 20th century as a group of young socialist revolutionaries, including founders of the future state of Israel like David Ben-Gurion, immigrated in waves from Russia and Eastern Europe. This is true. Socialist revolutionaries. I wouldn't call them revolutionaries. Again, it's imposing a particular bias and a label to these people, like that they came to Israel with the intent of creating a state there. No, they came to Israel to escape, right? So the waves she's talking about. Okay, so I learned about this in high school, also learned about this in other classes. That Zionism as we know it, as a movement which said that Jews should move to Israel to establish a homeland there, to fulfill our history, like we pray 3 times a day to return to Israel, and to live in peace, safe from anti-Semitism, persecution, and oppression. Okay? So in 1888, there's a guy named Leo Pinsker who wrote an article called Auto-Emancipation that said, just look it up, you can Google him, Leo Pinsker, Auto-Emancipation, which said in a nutshell, we got to take matters into our own hand. Let's not continue living at the whim of the majority anti-Semitic government in which we live. Let's get up and move. So 1888, 1897, Theodor Herzl comes along and establishes the Zionist. And as a result of 1888, there's a group of Jews who go to Israel known as Bilu, B-I-L-U, Beit Yaakov Lechu V'Nelcha. That's what it stands for, those 4 Hebrew words. Yes, Israel, let's get up and go. So the first established communities in Israel, Petach Tikva, other communities like that, were as a result of Leo Pinsker. So Jews started coming, answering this call, because pogroms were on the rise. So there's 1897 with Theodor Herzl, who, as a reporter for the Vienna newspaper in Paris, witnessed the framing and trial and conviction of Alfred Dreyfus in Paris, which was a whole other impetus for secular Jews to make the trip to Israel. The Bilu movement were mostly Orthodox Jews moving to Israel and establishing religious communities in Israel. Theodor Herzl made this movement secular and much larger, more popular. So 1897, Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, also trying to establish a homeland for the Jews in Israel. Okay, are they revolutionaries? I guess technically speaking, they're revolutionaries because they're doing something that hadn't been there before. That's a revolution. But a revolution in this context, we might think of armed conflict. There's no armed conflict. Theodor Herzl who met with the Kaiser of Germany and other leaders in Europe to try to get influence, have their influence to allow the Jews to settle in Israel, to buy land in Israel, and to eventually establish a state in Israel, just like there are other states in Europe at the time. These waves continue. 1903, the Kishinev pogrom in Kishinev, Russia, also prompted a wave of immigration. Now, most of the Jews immigrating during this time are coming to America. 1888 to 1925 was the largest influx of Jews and Polish and Italian and Irish immigration to this country until the United States government closed the doors in 1925. So 1888 to 1925, huge wave of Jewish immigration around to America, with a little bit going to Israel. Okay, so kibbutzim are established, And yes, 1903. Then German Jews come. I'm also kind of oversimplifying this. German Jews come to Israel in the 1930s because of the rise of Hitler. Okay, so different waves add to the what's called the Yishuv, which is Hebrew for settlement. This is what the Jewish community in the land of Israel is called, the Yishuv, led by Theodor Herzl, the Zionist Congress's representative, which is David Ben-Gurion, and others before him, Chaim Weitzman, and others who are part of the leadership trying to make a state, but not in a military way. Okay, so we go on. Fleeing ghettos, impoverishment, and the violence of pogroms, they believe that the only answer to the global affliction of anti-Semitism was Zionism, the vision of a Jewish home in the land of the Hebrew Bible. Yes, it's the land of the Hebrew Bible. But again, I just want, the land of the Hebrew Bible makes it the mythical home. Okay, it's not the mythical home. As she just pointed out in footnote number 1, we've been there. Corroborating evidence shows that we've been there for 3,200 years. Okay, so it's not, it's the vision of the Jewish home from the Bible, from biblical times, that's incorporated into the prayer book. Okay, so it's part of the Jewish psyche to return to Israel. Okay, the Allied powers of the West defeated the Ottomans during World War I. Now, the Ottoman Empire was allied with Germany. So that's how they were defeated, right? Eventually, Britain and France and the United States defeated Germany and the Ottoman Empire. Afterward, one of the first big tests for the League of Nations, established by the Allies as a worldwide body of governments, right, President Wilson, was to decide the future of Palestine. Okay, so you got this territory. How are you going to chop up the Ottoman Empire now? Who's going to be in charge of that territory that had been ruled by the enemy, the Ottoman Empire enemy? So how the West taking over territory that they conquered, how are you going to divvy it up? The League carved up the former Ottoman lands, right? Footnote number 4. The new borders were the same as those drawn in a secret deal the British and French made in 1916 called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Okay? We have to remember that around the world, Britain is number 1 at this time. The United States is new to the world scene. Okay, the fact that President Wilson was instrumental in establishing the League of Nations, that's big for the United States. But Britain is number 1. Their empire is around the world, right? The sun never sets on the British Empire. That's true at the end of World War I, which is why Britain has a major say, and France as well, secondary to Britain, in carving up and getting control over these lands. Why do they speak French in Lebanon and Syria? Because the French were there. Why do they speak English in Israel? Because the British were there. Okay, so the League carved up the former Ottoman lands, granting Britain 2 mandates to govern Palestine and Iraq, and giving France 1 mandate for Syria and Lebanon. Okay, right? So that's why French is a common language in Lebanon and Syria. Well, it's also language in Vietnam. The French were there too. In the language of soft colonialism, the League's charter directed Britain and France to govern the territories for the well-being of their inhabitants until such time as they are able to stand alone. This is very true, and this is a whole problem that modern people, progressive people, see today with the history of the world. That this whole idea of colonialism, the idea that we're better than you, we're going to take care of you. We, and it had a religious sense too, we are religiously superior to your backward religion or paganism, right? Which is how Europe would see Africa, how Europe would see the Native Americans in America, these backward heathen people. We need to bring religion to you, but also we need to bring modernity to you. And who can argue that modernity is number one? Everybody wants to be modern. Okay, so this is reflecting this idea that we're carving up the land because we have the infrastructure. There's no infrastructure there, or it's dirt roads and outhouses and wells. We're going to bring roads and railroads, which they did, the British did and the French did. We're going to make the country better, and then we'll move out eventually. We'll also strip you of all your resources, but we're going to leave it for you in a better place, right? And so the criticism of colonial, just look at Africa as a result of this this hard colonialism that went to soft colonialism. Okay, so there's that's reflected here too. All right, so Britain and France carve up the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. France gets what is essentially Lebanon and Syria today. Britain gets what is essentially Israel and Jordan today, and also establish a kingdom in Saudi Arabia, right? That's Lawrence of Arabia, right? And then also get Iraq. All right, so they get a lot larger territory, but most of it's desert, okay? Oh, and it happens to have oil too. Okay, the mandate for Palestine, written in 1920, stood out for its international commitment to the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Okay, so the mandate is based on the Balfour Declaration. So Lord Balfour wrote to Chaim Weizmann, who then was the president of the Zionist Congress, saying that Her Majesty's government looks favorably upon the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Okay, so you have that letter that was written in 1917. Oh, I don't think it was written to Chaim Weizmann. It might have been written to the Rothschilds. Whatever it is, written to a Jewish leader, and stands for all time as like the history. From a Jewish narrative, that letter is the important point. Okay, from a non-Jewish narrative, the letter goes into effect in 1920 with the establishment of the British mandate in Palestine. Bob.
Well, at the same time, the British were making promises to the Arabs.
You'll see this in this article. Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Okay. That's yes. As this article goes on, and we're not going to get to it today. We'll get to it next time. We'll see the promises that Britain gave to the Arab, how the Arabs dealt with this increased. So the native population, who are mostly farmers and some businessmen, but business like little markets and things like that. So not like corporations or anything, see that Jews are coming in. So when they're coming in small waves, okay, that's good. Larger numbers, oh, that's a problem. And they're taking over, and they're also buying land. Now, where do they get the authority, these Jews, to buy land? Now, the Ottoman Empire sometimes sold land. They had the authority because they were the empire, but they're divvying up farmland that had been farmed for centuries, but there's no title to it. So who needs title when you're just living there? So that's an issue. Britain brings this whole idea of bureaucracy, and they survey the land, and they just agree to sell some of it for the establishment of kibbutzim. So kibbutzim get established on it, yeah, all around Israel, because the Jewish National Fund, which was set up to buy land in Israel, buy the land from British mandatory authorities that were set up as soft colonialists. So you understand from the Palestinian perspective how this is a whole outsider versus insider, colonial versus native kind of argument. And all I'm trying to point out is that the Jews shouldn't be wrapped into that category and be labeled as colonialists. And that's the problem with the conversation today. Many people from the Palestinian perspective see the Jews in Israel and the state of Israel itself as a result of colonialists, white people coming from Europe, making this state here that hadn't been there before into a colonial power. And the whole idea of Israel acting with apartheid policies against the Palestinians all is part of that colonial kind of narrative. Okay, so any other questions or comments before we close for today? Yeah, Bob.
The DNA of the Palestinians or Jordanians must be identical.
I think so. I do think so. Technically speaking, yes. Most the nomadic tribes were living in Jordan, and the Britain randomly picked one tribal family to be the king of Jordan.
Right.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. When you go to Israel and you're standing in front of the hotel, I remember going down some tunnels.
Yes.
Okay, and they were relatively new. They weren't there when I first went there in the 70s.
Right.
But what is the age of those?
Those tunnels are there if you're going if you're looking at the hotel going left. Are you talking about those tunnels?
Yeah.
Yes, those tunnels there are a way archaeologically to access what the temple area looked like 2,000 years ago before the Romans destroyed it.
Okay,
so that's mainly from King Herod, who was the king of Israel, the Roman puppet king of Israel, until the Romans destroyed the temple in the year 70. So you can have access, so you could see the rest of the wall, which is the retaining wall, or you can walk along there all the way until the western wall meets the northern wall. Okay, and then outside, you can, if you're looking at the kotel, go right. You can walk along the kotel until it meets so you walk along the western wall until it meets the southern wall. Okay, all part of this retaining wall that holds up what is the Temple Mount. Okay.
Just the British not only made deals with the Balfour Declaration, but with the Arabs as part of the Arab Revolt. But I think they're trying to get Turkey out of the war, and they're going to make a deal with them.
Right. Well, the country that we know as Turkey is the leftover of the Ottoman Empire.
But they're trying to get Turkey out of the war, and they try to make a deal. The British,
yes.
I used to work for a British company, and we had all sorts of comments about why the sun never sets on the British Empire. Right. The good Lord doesn't trust them in the dark.
Right. Okay. So yes, you can read lots and lots of stuff about the British Empire, the colonialism, what life was like in India, what life was like in British Africa, in the Far East, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so that was the beginning background to the article. Hopefully next time. So next time is going to be, we will meet next Monday. It's 2 Mondays from now, President's Day itself, that we will not meet. So we'll continue looking at this article next Monday. Have a good rest of the day, everybody.